Okay, so today we'll start with Reies Lopez Tijerina. Sometimes I'll just refer to him as Tijerina. He was a Mexican-American from New Mexico who's founded an organization called La Alianza, the Alliance, La Alianza Federal de Mercedes. And some of his background, he was an evangelical preacher, pastor, and he was also a lawyer. And he was a very, he was a good public speaker. And he argued, he was an activist with La Alianza. And again, a reminder that part of what is happening in the 1960s is Mexican Americans are no longer counting on politicians they elect to bring about the change they want to see in their communities. They are creating organizations for direct action to bring about the change they want to see in their own communities. So in this case, he founds La Alianza, and then La Alianza does an occupation of a national forest. And he argues that the land on which that national forest sits used to be part of the Tierra Amarilla land grant. And that land was illegally taken from the rightful owners of that land grant. And he was basing this also on the rights that Mexican Americans were supposed to get as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the treaty that ended the Mexican-American War in 1848. So they did an occupation of the national forest. This was one of the common themes in the 1960s would be, or one of the tactics would be occupations. And so it'll be something that comes up quite a bit for the 1960s, along with other tactics like sit-ins or teach-ins. There's also occupations. All right, so in this case, they go to the national forest and occupy it. And they do a citizen's arrest of the park rangers. And they call in the media, and they're trying to bring attention to this issue that Mexican Americans' land had been taken away illegally. So that was one of the first incidents that got them national attention. Another incident was a raid on a courthouse where members of La Alianza, not including Tijerina himself, went to the courthouse to do a citizen's arrest of the district attorney, who was also Mexican American, by the way. But they were going there to do a citizen's arrest of the district attorney. And it went bad. It ended up breaking out into a shootout. And so it brought them very bad attention. In fact, the National Guard was called in. They sent in 200 military vehicles and about 400 soldiers. And so here you have, sort of people, kind of poor people in New Mexico, and then the National Guard being sent in, including tanks, to deal with the fear of La Alianza. Tijerina, there were efforts, like the documentary brings up, there were efforts to work together with other Mexican Americans and with other activists in the 1960s. But ultimately, a lot of that disintegrated with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Tijerina ended up getting put in prison for being the leader of La Alianza, and La Alianza being, the organization that was involved in that courthouse raid and shootout. And that was unfortunately kind of the end of Tijerina. There's among Chicano activists, there was a lot of talk afterwards saying that Tijerina was never the same. They believe that he was tortured or seriously injured while he was in prison, because he just never was the same. I actually got to meet him when I was in undergrad. At that point, he was already in a wheelchair, so not in the greatest of health. And he passed away about 10 years ago. Next person, very important to the Chicano movement, one of the most important, would be Corky Gonzalez. The background of Corky Gonzalez, he used to be a boxer, and he was also an organizer for politicians. And it was, he fell into the kind of, he's a really good representation of that transition from the Mexican American generation to a Chicano generation, because he, like lots of Mexican Americans prior to the Chicano movement, were supporting politicians, getting involved in like Viva Kennedy groups to help get Kennedy elected in the first place, and other politicians. But ultimately, the Chicano generation is one that gets disillusioned with politicians being able to help them. They concluded that politicians would only pay attention to them when they were campaigning to be elected. And once elected, they wouldn't bring about change for their communities. So again, Corky Gonzalez follows that model of founding their own local organization, the Crusade for Justice in the state of Colorado. And he did have more success in coordinating with Mexican Americans throughout the Southwest. He hosted the first Chicano Youth Conference in 1969. At this conference brought youth from all over the United States, especially the Southwest. There, he introduced them to a poem of his called I Am Joaquin. I Am Joaquin is a poem that's also brought up in the film that you just watched, Walkout, and there's a study guide question regarding that speech or poem. So yeah, it's a poem he had written a couple of years prior. At this Chicano Youth Conference, they were introduced to another poem by a man named Alurista that was about Aztlan. And again, remember, Aztlan was the place of origin of the Aztecs. That was somewhere in the north. And to Chicanos in the 1960s during the Chicano movement, they believed Aztlan was the US Southwest. They kind of equated it with the states that were lost by Mexico in the Mexican-American War. And that also connects to the fact that the Chicano generation identifies with their Native American background. And so hence terms like Aztlan becoming more prominent. One of the results of this Chicano Youth Conference was a plan called El Plan Espiritual de Aztlan, the spiritual plan of Aztlan, which was just a kind of a written an outline of the goals and things that this new movement wanted to achieve. And so, it had to do with things like just bettering their communities and kind of reflecting their new ideology of being no longer identifying as white, but identifying instead as a historically discriminated against group of color within the United States. And so then they start paralleling a lot more the actions of the Black Power movements, the African American, the civil rights movement, period. On that note, there were groups like the Brown Berets. The Brown Berets, like the Black Panthers for African Americans, were the result of these communities getting frustrated with the nonviolent approaches of earlier activists like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez. They thought they needed to be more aggressive. They felt that these nonviolent people, were just gonna turn the other cheek and get assassinated, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Or after this, Malcolm X. So they believed in BAM, by any means necessary. They believed in being more militant, and so hence they represented that in the way they dressed, the way they stood, the fact that they wore uniforms, so a little bit more militarized. One of their areas of emphasis was police brutality. And so again, police complaints by minority groups of color about the police and police brutality are not new. And this also, well, I'll bring it up now. This also connects to where they tended to recruit from. Organizations like the Crusade for Justice would recruit community organizers, but a lot of these Chicano youth that would go to the national Chicano youth conferences, many of them were college students. Certainly a majority of them were college students. The Brown Berets were different in that most of their recruitment came from the youth in these communities that would be the most likely to get involved in crime or street gangs. So they're recruiting from a different segment of society. It's not the college students. They're recruiting from the youth that they're trying to help get help them get in a better direction of, instead of street gangs or crime, to do something for themselves and for their community. And hence why they would also be more aware and conscious of how the police would treat them. One of their emphasis was to inform themselves of the law and their rights. One example of that would be that these groups started informing themselves, for example, their Second Amendment rights and carrying firearms. These groups would even police the police. They would follow police vehicles when they would come into their neighborhoods. And, when the police would pull someone over, they would get out of their vehicles with their weapons and, they'd be aware of their rights, what is legal for them to carry, and the distance they needed to be away from the police to not interfere with their job, and just make sure that the police weren't violating the rights of the people that they were pulling over. Coincidentally, at this time, the governor of California was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan, at that time, started passing, what do they call it? What's the term people use? Maybe gun reform, yeah, he started passing laws that limited their Second Amendment rights because of groups like the Black Panthers and the Brown Berets starting to exercise their Second Amendment rights. They also created community centers. They created free health clinics. They created breakfast programs. At this time, in the 1960s, the United States government did not yet provide breakfast to children going to school. Groups like the Brown Berets and the Black Panthers would started providing breakfast to children before, so that they could, be well fed when they go to school. And then the government felt the pressure and started providing these breakfast programs. But groups like this and actions that these groups took helped lead the government to be able to provide those services. The Brown Berets in Los Angeles had a coffee house called the Piranha Coffee House. They also created their own newspaper. And so again, it's this theme of the mainstream newspapers not covering this community, these neighborhoods, or their perspectives. And so then they created their own media to inform their own communities of what was going on in their neighborhoods. Again, they were following the example of the Black Panthers in many respects. There's also, for Puerto Ricans in the East Coast, there were the Young Lords. And Juan Gonzalez, the author of Harvest of Empire, was a founder of the Young Lords. In fact, I think this is him right here. Yeah. And these groups, these communities, these groups, again, would create their own media. Here, look, Central Committee, Juan Gonzalez, kind of having their own media, their own way of educating kind of their communities. And again, you see the influence of the Black Panthers. And then also, many of these groups also tried to become political parties. And so there was also ideas of, these ideas that the two-party system was not working for these communities, and they wanted to create their own political parties. Okay, these are things that are not covered in the documentary you saw. Well, actually, that's not true. Chicano moratorium was, definitely. Then after that, it's things that were not. In the documentary you watched, Chicano Quest for a Homeland, you were introduced to the Chicano moratorium, organized by the Brown Berets. It was a series of anti-Vietnam War marches that happened throughout the country. The largest one, the last one, was in Los Angeles. And that was the one where, while the march, no, it was after the march happened, and then it ended in a rally at a park. The police decided to pool the permits for the event when there were already tens of thousands of people there and the event was in full swing. The police excuse was that there were some Mexican American youth who did a beer run from a liquor store, went into a liquor store, stole some beer, and then ran into the park. So then that was the excuse the police used to pull the permits of the event and then descend on the park with hundreds of police officers in riot gear and started by force concluding this event. And in the documentary, you get to see how they shot tear gas projectiles and beat up the people at the event. You know, the rally was an event. It was organized by the Brown Berets, but the people at the event were just the community. It was families. They had speakers and dancers and musicians and performers and poets. They were just sitting at the park, attending the event, watching the performance. This led to a lot of violence, a lot of chaos, and part of that included the police going to a bar called the Silver Dollar Cafe. They opened the door and shot a tear gas projectile into the bar that was full of people. And they happened to hit in the head with a tear gas projectile Rubén Salazar. Rubén Salazar was a journalist in, what was it, the Los Angeles Times. He was also part of the Spanish TV station and news. He was the only person that Mexican Americans, or specifically Chicanos, because he did identify as a Chicano, one of the only people in the mainstream media that this community had. And the police coincidentally hit this person in the head with a tear gas projectile and killed him. Now, the sheriffs claimed that they claimed that they had made an announcement telling everyone to leave the bar. They claimed that it was a coincidence, a bad coincidence, that the person who got hit was the only advocate this community had in the mainstream media. But the Chicano community did not believe that. They think it was too much of a coincidence that their one advocate was, literally hit in the head and killed. And this theme of it having been done on purpose remained for many decades. It wasn't until I think it was the early 2000s that I want to say something like 2007, 2005, 2007, something like that. Los Angeles got a Chicano mayor, and then there was kind of a reopening of this case, and police authorities released a long report looking into this. And essentially their conclusion was that they found no evidence of it having been done on purpose. And so again, it's I don't know if that worked. I think there's still there's still the belief by Chicano activists that it could not have been a coincidence. Yeah. All right. So that was one event, and one that was brought up in that documentary. One that was not brought up was Chicano Park in 1970. That's a picture of me at Chicano Park by a statue of Emiliano Zapata, a Mexican revolutionary. Chicano Park is in San Diego County, Southern California. And the state of California was planning to put, there's an ethnic Mexican neighborhood called Barrio Logan. And the state of California decided they were going to put a jail and CHP station, California Highway Patrol station there. And the community protested against this, led by the Brown Berets. And it was one of those kind of classic protests, you know, like people chaining themselves to trees to prevent bulldozers from clearing the land and stuff like that. And they were ultimately successful. They succeeded in not having a jail and California Highway Patrol station built there. And instead, there is a park there today. And, you know, there's still kind of these freeway bridges that run over it, parts of it, but they filled it up with murals. They just used those freeway bridges to help them put up a bunch of murals about Chicano history and culture. Another activity of the Brown Berets was their occupation. Remember, I talked about occupations. The occupation of Catalina Island in 1972. Catalina Island is one of a handful of islands off the coast of California. Catalina Island is the biggest and most sort of the largest population of any of the islands off the coast of California. And the Brown Berets went there and really symbolically occupied it. They showed up, they said, we're occupying it, did press releases. And again, they were connecting it to their history and to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo as well, similar to Tijerina, saying that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is the treaty that gave the United States, you know, the Southwest. The treaty said what was included in it, but it never included the islands off the coast of California. So those islands should still belong to Mexico. And so that was part of their activism. They were there for, I don't know, I don't recall exactly how long, maybe a couple weeks. And that was that. A much bigger occupation that was similar to that was done by the American Indian movement in the island of Alcatraz, where there's an old prison there, kind of in the San Francisco Bay Area. That one lasted something like 18 months. And that one was, you know, for similar reasons, kind of just protests, occupying, again, one of the strategies of the civil rights movement. And, you know, that ended up being removed by force with the FBI and, you know, weapons and all that, and arresting people. Organizations like the Young Lords, the Brown Berets, and the Black Panthers ended up being taken down, destroyed by the government with programs like the FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO for short. This program would infiltrate organizations like the Brown Berets and the Black Panthers. And they wouldn't just infiltrate and report back about what they were doing. They were sent in as agent provocateurs. What are agent provocateurs? They are people who would try to get the organization to do illegal things so that police authorities would have a reason to shut them down and arrest and incarcerate their members. The problem was that there were agent provocateurs that were put into these organizations by different law enforcement authorities that were not working with each other. So the FBI put in an agent provocateur. Los Angeles Police Department would put in their provocateurs. The ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, would put in their agent provocateurs. And so then, these agent provocateurs would be at meetings, and their goal was to try to get them to do illegal things so that they could be shut down and arrested. But they didn't know that the other people in the meeting encouraging the doing of illegal things were other agent provocateurs from other law enforcement agencies. And so they were reporting on each other, not knowing that they were all agent provocateurs. But this ended up being successful. They used what agent provocateurs were saying as justification for the incarceration and shutting down of these organizations. It wasn't until many decades later that through the Freedom of Information Act, researchers were able to get, request the evidence of these agent provocateurs from law enforcement agencies. And that's when we found out that there were even meetings where a majority of the people at the meeting were agent provocateurs. And so, yeah, they were able to do that. They successfully destroyed these organizations by the early 1970s. And it's not until decades later that we find out the truth. Another thing about the dismantling of these organizations, I mentioned that they would recruit from the youth who would be most susceptible to crime and to street gangs. The dismantling of these organizations ended up inadvertently creating new street gangs after their absence. The Bloods and Crips, for example, came as a result of the aftermath of some of the founders of the Bloods and Crips were people who had been involved in the Black Panthers, and in the absence of the Black Panthers, instead created street gangs. And we'll talk more about street gangs later, but just a reminder of how these different pieces of history interconnect. So yeah, just an image of people, Chicanos protesting against the Vietnam War. Ruben Salazar, our fight is at home, not in Vietnam, Chicano power. Now, you might notice the term raza. Raza sí, guerra no. Which means kind of like the people, yes, no to war. Or raza primero. Viva la causa, long live the cause. Now, in the US, the word race is a very kind of loaded term. And but in Spanish, the word race, raza, has a different connotation. For example, I've heard been in Mexico listening to the radio, and there'll be a disc jockey, on the radio saying like, buenos días, raza, ¿cómo están el día de hoy? Blah, blah, blah. So they're saying, they're using the term raza as a way of referring to like the people. It's not a reference to one specific racial group over another. And so it's got different connotations. Moctezuma Esparza was one of the members of the Brown Berets. He was also, he was a member of the Brown Berets. He was involved in the walkouts. And he ended up becoming an award-winning film producer. I got to meet him when I was in undergrad as well. And he played important roles, or was producer for the films Selena, about a Mexican-American singer. about the Ballad of Gregorio Cortez. We learned about Gregorio Cortez when we learned about Social Bandits. Then other films that are not related to Chicano history or not directly, like Gettysburg or Gods and Generals, although we did learn that there were Mexican Americans who fought in the Civil War, including at the Battle of Gettysburg. And then the film that you just watched for homework, Walkout. So he was in the Walkouts, and then he helped create the movie about the Walkouts. So one of the actors in the film plays him when he was young. Moving on from the Brown Berets to M.E.Ch.A. M.E.Ch.A is a Chicano college student organization that came out of those annual national Chicano youth conferences. So I mentioned that Corky Gonzalez organized the first one in Colorado. The second one the next year was in Santa Barbara, California. And that's where these college students decided to come together. You know, they were all part of organizations like MAPA, the Mexican American Political Association, or I don't remember other ones right now, but they were members of lots of different Mexican American college organizations. And at this point, they decided to adopt the term Chicano and to kind of shed their old organizations, join forces, and create one larger national organization called M.E.Ch.A. M.E.Ch.A stands for Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, which means the Chicano student movement of Aztlán. So it was created in 1969. It came out of the Chicano Youth Conference in 1969. It came out sort of the result of that youth conference was the Plan de Santa Barbara, which included things like creating an organization like M.E.Ch.A and working nationally and stuff like that. So yeah, that was a founding document, a founding, an important influence. Now, this Plan of Santa Barbara was not militant like, say, the Brown Berets. It was actually, I don't know what the term is at the moment, but, you know, in certain ways, it was similar to the Mexican American generation in that they believed in education as being an important factor in the betterment of the community. Again, this was predominantly college students doing this. With that said, they were different from the Mexican American generation in that, you know, they were taking pride in their Native American background, like by using the word Aztlán, and and identifying as Chicanos, not as Mexican Americans. So M.E.Ch.A got started then, and it still exists today. So hence, it is one of the most enduring legacies of the Chicano movement. Antonio Villaraigosa was the first Chicano mayor of the city of Los Angeles since the 19th century. And it wasn't until the 21st century that happened. He was a member of M.E.Ch.A. Cruz Bustamante went on to become lieutenant governor of California in the early 21st century. And I, you know, do not compare to any of these people. I just wanted to share that I was active with M.E.Ch.A in high school and undergrad. And so Again, M.E.Ch.A means Chicano Student Movement of Aztlan. But in 2019, there was a split between M.E.Ch.A. Some M.E.Ch.A chapters throughout the country decided to change their name from M.E.Ch.A to M.E.P.A, the Student Movement of Progressive Action. They did this because, and there's a split, some of them decided to stay M.E.Ch.A, others changed to M.E.P.A. And yeah, and there's M.E.Ch.A chapters literally from coast to coast, still today. Why was there a split? Why did some of them become M.E.P.A? One of them is that they did not want to exclude anyone by having the term Chicano in it, so that anyone of any background could feel comfortable joining them. And so, yeah, that's good. Although it's also interesting, in the 1990s, when I started college, there was a period where people who were not of Mexican American background were increasingly identifying as Chicano. There was this idea that as long as you were in support of kind of like the ideals of the Chicano movement, that you could identify as Chicano. That ended up not sticking. And so hence, I think, again, why there was a sense that they needed to be more inclusive. Another part was by getting rid of Aztlan, I think they were thinking that a couple things. One is that the Aztecs are not the only indigenous group in Mexico. There's lots of different indigenous groups in Mexico, not just the Aztecs. So there's that part of it. And another part of it is, being in the United States and to try to not step on the toes of Native Americans that are in the United States who have their own history and struggles, and, to not like step on their toes and speak for them by saying that they're, just as Native American as they are. And so I think those are the kind of things they had in mind when some of the groups, when there was a split and some of them decided to become M.E.P.A. Chicano studies. Chicano studies is the most important legacy of the Chicano movement. Rudy Acuna is a historian who wrote the first book about Mexican American history. One of the chapters you read for this class was from his book called Occupied America, again, kind of connecting to these Occupy movements that were prevalent in the 1960s as part of the civil rights movement. And so, yeah, the Chicano movement led to the creation of many Chicano studies programs throughout the country. And yeah, I think, it plays a role in me having a job today with a Latin American studies program. And that isn't, so yeah, there was a creation. There were a lot of people who got an education, who became academics, who founded Chicano studies programs, and they're throughout the country. That isn't to say that there haven't been attacks against Chicano studies programs. And one of the biggest ones have to do with Arizona in 2010 with a House bill called 2281. And and there's a few documentaries that came out about this topic. One is called Outlawing Shakespeare. Another one is called Precious Knowledge. Another one is called Banned in Arizona. There's all these different documentaries that were made about this topic. But let me tell you about it on my own here. So we've all learned in US history about Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 that made it illegal to segregate children in public schools based on race. One of the readings you're going to read in the next couple weeks is a reading where you're going to learn that people often reference civil rights laws, specifically Brown v. Board of Education, as an example of how we ended desegregation. Although there's an argument to be made that Brown v. Board of Education did not actually end racial segregation. It ended legal racial segregation, but not de facto, not the fact that it's still happening. Brown v. Board of Education told the US public that they needed to desegregate their schools with this statement: with all deliberate speed. With all deliberate speed sounds pretty fast, but it's really vague. It doesn't say within a year of today, within 5 years of today, within 10 years of today. And so there were many parts of the country that didn't want to desegregate and did not desegregate. So hence, 20 years later in the 1970s, there was another movement to try to finally desegregate schools in the United States. One of those was the busing system, where children from different communities would be bused to other communities so that they would attend schools that were desegregated. And in the case of Arizona, the federal government gave the state of Arizona a desegregation order in 1974, telling them, you have to desegregate your schools. It's been 20 years and you still haven't done it. So the state of Arizona took another, 23 years to do something about it. That was the creation of their Mexican American Studies program. So in 1997, they create the Mexican American Studies program, and it had a lot of success. The children, the young people who participated in the Mexican American Studies program, were getting reading scores that were 4 times higher than their peers, writing scores that were 3 times higher than their peers, math scores 2.5 times higher. They had 200 times greater college enrollment. They had a higher graduation rate. 97% of them graduated high school as opposed to 44% of their peers. And the greatest impact was on the youth that other programs had the hardest time reaching. And so that would be low-income students, Latino students, and males. There were 5 independent reviews that came to these conclusions. So the Mexican American Studies program was in place from 2002 to 2011. And in 2010, there were attacks on the Mexican American Studies program. The state of Arizona, passed House Bill 2281, and then signed by their governor, Jan Brewer. And it said, 2281 said these 4 things. It said that in Arizona, you could not have any programs that promoted the overthrow of the US government, You cannot have any programs that would promote resentment toward a race or class of people. You could not have programs that were designed primarily for students of a particular ethnic group. And you could not have any programs that would advocate ethnic solidarity instead of treating pupils as individuals. So those are the four things that House Bill 2281 said. So then the government of Arizona investigated the Mexican American Studies program, specifically in Tucson Unified School District. And the own government's investigation concluded that the Mexican American Studies program did not do any of these four things. The state of Arizona's own investigation concluded that the Mexican American Studies program didn't do any of these four things. They did not promote the overthrow of the government. They did not promote resentment. It was designed, obviously, Mexican American Studies, designed for Mexican American students, and Mexican Americans being the largest ethnic group in Arizona. But anyone could take those classes, and people of every background did take those classes. Yeah, and then advocating ethnic solidarity. I think it was more about advocating solidarity, period, among everyone. But at any rate, the government investigation concluded that they did not violate any of these things, but that didn't matter. In January 2012, the state of Arizona told Tucson Unified School District that they had to get rid of their Mexican American Studies program. The state did this by threatening to cut 10% of their funding. 10% was $3 million a month. And so, yeah, so they were, even though the state's own investigation concluded they didn't violate House Bill 2281, it didn't matter. They were still disbanded, shut down. It also included the banning of many books. There was a list, I don't remember, of like 50 books that would be banned from Arizona schools, including Occupied America. That's that book I told you that Rudy Acuna wrote, the first Mexican-American history book written by a Mexican-American, and that you read one chapter of in this class. It included Occupied America. It even included Shakespeare's The Tempest among the books. There were legal battles that were fought for 7 years, from 2010 to 2017. In the meantime, the Mexican American Studies program was brought back in kind of a whitewashed form. Some of the books on their list of banned books were removed. In 2017, a federal court determined that House Bill 2281 was racist and had been created for political gain. Again, there's different documentaries about this topic, and the topic of ethnic studies, Chicano studies being among them, AP, history classes, honors classes, diversity, equity, and inclusion would be the latest focus. Before that, it was critical race theory. There's every few years there's a rebranding of the target. So yeah, we could include today's attacks on DEI. But yeah, here's some earlier ones. In 2020, Trump ended federal training of anti-bias, white privilege, and critical race theory because it was anti-American propaganda. In 2021, Biden revoked that executive order. And then now we have a Trump administration again that is obviously interested in getting rid of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So the challenges against Chicano studies and ethnic studies and so forth continue.